Good evening, everyone. Once again, thank you for coming out here. I know it's a little cold, it's a little windy, it's a little dark, but I'm sure that you will enjoy the talk that we will have tonight. My name is Vice Consul Esperado, and welcome to tonight's artist talk brought to us by the Philippine Consulate General and PURO ARTE. I would like to call on the Deputy Consul General, Ambrosia Bryan and Cisa III, for the welcoming remarks. A round of applause.
Thank you, Vice Consul Macris. As she's mentioned, thank you very much, everybody, for making the trip here to the Consulate General. When the weather turns in Los Angeles, everybody panics because it never rains in LA. Apparently, we have some weather, although it's mostly non-existent. So, on behalf of Consul General Adelio Angelito S. Cruz, Conjun Adel, who is on an official mission to Nevada in Las Vegas, which is also part of our jurisdiction with a high concentration of Filipinos, I want to welcome everyone to the Philippine Consulate General this evening for our 2019 edition of Artists Talk. I was mentioning earlier that we're very lucky that, you know, with whatever limited resources that the Consulate General has, that we are still able to do things that are beyond the usual mandate of the consulate, which is to provide consular services. Of course, we have to feed other aspects of the overseas Filipinos' life, and part of that is culture. And not just traditional culture, because a lot of people associate Filipino culture with what traditional culture we have as a people, although we all know that culture can encompass the cultural products that our civilization, that our nation produces, even though it is modern, even though the disciplines are based on Western education and Western study. What is a product of a Filipino artist becomes part of Filipino culture. The paintings that we celebrate in the National Museum were done under European masters, but were painted by Filipino hands. And now it forms part of our Filipino cultural heritage. And, you know, before I get carried off, mouthing off about culture, I want to read a short message that was prepared by the Consul General for this occasion. Warmest greetings and best wishes to PURO ARTE and to the Philippine Consulate General as you hold the series of visual art activities entitled Kasiningan. On today, 20th November, and on other days this November, the Philippine Consulate General is proud to collaborate with PURO ARTE on this cultural promotion endeavor, which was organized to allow the community, the Philam community, to meet and be inspired by the works of renowned Filipino visual artists such as filmmaker Raymond, one of the pioneer figures of modern Philippine alternative cinema, as well as Dr. Edson Cabalfin, curator of The City with Two Navels, which is the 2018 Venice Biennale an architecture exhibit contribution of the Philippines. Otherwise, I would have slipped over that word. I would also have to mention that we are saddened that another distinguished panelist for tonight, Ms. Saiza Cruz Bacani, was not able to make it for health reasons. But it bears mentioning that she is, among other things, a 2015 awardee of the Magnum Fellow Human Rights Fellowship. She does black and white photography, for those who are unfamiliar with her work. I would like to acknowledge PURO ARTE's commitment and passion in promoting the development and propagation of a unique brand of Philippine culture and arts by encouraging Filipino artists through programs designed to display and promote their works beyond our country's shores, such as this activity called Kasiningan. Also worthy of commendation is PURO ARTE's advocacy to organize activities to provide a vehicle for Filipino-American artists to share their various expressions, showcasing cutting-edge work in visual arts, performance, music, literature, media, and other forms in a venue that could educate and enrich the community. The Philippine Consulate General in Los Angeles looks forward to many more opportunities to collaborate with PURO ARTE and wishes the organization continued success in their future undertaking. So, once again, welcome to the Consulate General. Hindi na natin patatagalin. I will now introduce Mr. Ruben Domingo. I would like to call him up to the podium. He represents PURO ARTE, and as he says his welcome remarks, he will also introduce more in-depth tonight's distinguished panel of artists. So once again, palakpakan po natin si Mr. Ruben Domingo of PURO ARTE.
Hello, good evening. Thank you, Vice Consul General Ambo. Everybody, thank you for being here. I know none of you have heard of PURO ARTE, but this is probably your first introduction to our group. We are a non-profit organization focusing on Filipino and Filipino-American arts and culture. We're trying to get more active. We started last year with an art exhibit, then a concert. So this is our third event, and we plan to have more events focusing on arts. We don't know what. I mean, it can come in different forms. So Kasiningan is a series of different art forms or art people or art focuses or voices. It was started by, it was actually introduced to us by Consul General Cruz. Kasi last year, they had this art talk with the community. And they wanted to do another art talk. So I was in discussion with him and trying to solicit help because I was trying to get Dr. Cabalfin to have an audience here in the Philippines. I mean, an audience here in LA, and we wanted his support. So he supported us and he introduced this effort. So in the same talk, and they wanted at least 3 artists. So I got Dr. Cabalfin, and then I got Raymond, and then I got Saisa Cruz. Unfortunately, Saisa, a very active and very well, she's a very active. She's right now traveling all over the world. But during her work and in her assignment, she caught the dengue virus, so she's now indisposed. So we don't have her here, but as part of our program, please get our program. She has an exhibit right now at the Glendale Community College. So her works are there. So if you look at her works, you can more or less see what she's talking about. She is a child of a domestic helper who was practically raised in Hong Kong and ended up being a domestic helper herself. But at some time in her life, after graduating nursing and all of that, she decided to take hold of a camera, and she taught herself, or probably Googled it or whatnot. And then she just started posting her photographs until international photographers noticed her. Out of that, she got a fellowship from the Magnum, I keep forgetting the name of the, but it's Magnum Human Rights. But Magnum is an agency for journalists. They've been around since before the war. So then, this is top-notch photojournalist group of journalists that is being sent all over the world. So she got into that. So yung exhibit niya sa Glendale is a segment of what she does, her works. So anyway, so that's it. So I guess we might as well just get into this whole show. I'd like to introduce you to 2, I would consider them very important people in our community. And syempre, that's my bias. First of all, we have Dr. Edson Cabalfin. Please stand and take your seat. He's a she's at Cincinnati. She's an associate fellow in the Cincinnati School of Interior. Yeah. She's a student of the UP undergrad, master's in UP, and then went to Cornell, and then went to. But he's now in Cincinnati, and he holds a very distinguished position, which I hope speaks much about the Philippines in this community. Now, before we go into Edson, I'd like to introduce also Raymond. I think you sit down, and then we'll just do the thing one. Okay. So Edson is, I'm sorry. So Raymond is an alternative cinema filmmaker. So he is the first Filipino who garnered a Palme d'Or award for his short film, Amino. Palme d'Or is the French Oscar. Cannes films, right? So Palme d'Or is their task. So that's only one of the things that he does, or he has done. So this is our guest tonight. And so we'll have a short video, and then after that we'll probably talk, and then the other one will show a video and then talk. Something like that. It's a very important thing. Oh. Okay.
This was emailed today. This is from Saisa. Hello everyone, I am Saisa Cruz Bacani, a Filipina photographer. First, I would like to thank you all for coming tonight. I deeply apologize for not being able to join you in this event on Filipino art in Los Angeles because of some health issues. I'm not dying, and I'm on the way to recovery. Smile emoji. Just some issues with mosquitoes from my recent travel. Anyways, I would like to thank the Philippine Consulate General of Los Angeles for hosting this event. Artists like us need these kinds of support, and I'm super grateful for your patronage. Thank you, Puro Arte, Kita Kits, and Christine Park Gallery for bringing We Are Like Air to Los Angeles. To the person who is responsible and very persistent in making sure that the stories of migrant domestic workers can be seen and heard, Kuya Ruben, thank you so much. Thank you, Glendale Community College, for hosting the exhibition. May we all start to listen more, share love and kindness as our world needs it today. Maraming salamat and mabuhay. I hope to meet you all someday.
Magandang gabi po sa inyong lahat. Good evening. My name is Edson Cabalfin, and as Ruben has said, I'm Associate Professor in the School of Architecture and Interior Design at the University of Cincinnati. But I'm also here on the capacity as the curator of the Philippine Pavilion at the 16th Venice Architecture Biennale in 2018. What I'm going to talk about tonight is a part of that exhibition. I'm not going to talk about the entire exhibition, except to just mention that the exhibition entitled The City Who Had Two Navels was inspired by Nick Joaquin's novel, Filipino artist, national Filipino artist for literature, and based on the novel The Woman Who Had Two Navels, which he wrote in 1961. And in this novel, he talks about the struggles and the challenges of Filipino exiles who were based in Hong Kong, and the challenges of thinking about their identity based on the past, and also how they were dealing with their present, and therefore also affecting their future. Based on this idea, I felt that the question of what is Filipino identity is still important until today, even though he wrote this in 1961. And so the exhibit, The City Who Had Two Navels, I changed the title of The Woman Who Had Two Navels to The City, talks about these two forces of colonialism and neoliberalism. I'm not going to talk about the exhibition itself, but I would like to highlight, and this was the pavilion at the Venice Biennale in 2018. And we have this exhibition from May to November of 2018, and then this past July to October of 2019, we had a homecoming exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum of Manila along Ross Boulevard. And so this exhibition traveled from Venice to Manila, and this is just some of the images of that exhibition during in Venice. But tonight, I'd like to specifically talk about this question about representation, or how do we show ourselves as Filipinos, especially in the international setting. And I think this is perfect also because we are in LA, and then also the idea that we are Filipinos living abroad. And these are precisely the kind of issues in terms of how do we showcase ourselves. But to do that, I'd like to look at specifically just about architecture, because my training is in architecture. I'm an architectural historian and also an architect. And I'm going to look at specifically just as how is it that we show ourselves through the Philippine pavilions and villages that were shown in various international expositions over 100 years. I'm not going to talk about everything. I'll just talk and highlight about some of these expositions to highlight that the way we've been showing ourselves internationally has been a question and it has been happening for more than 100 years. And that's also what has been mentioned about earlier about this idea of how is it that then we are representing ourselves, how is it that we look at culture, our own culture, and how is it that we showcase it to the world. So these are just a very short list of different expositions that have been held over the last 100 years. I'm not going to talk about all of them, but what I just wanted to point out that since the Spanish colonial period, we have been represented in an international exposition, and then even until the American colonial period during the early 20th century, the United States have also shown us, and then even after World War II, when we became independent from the US, we've also continued to showcase ourselves until the end of my studies, 1998, and I'll explain more about that. So one thing to keep thinking about as I go through this presentation is just to begin to understand also, like as Filipinos, again, how do we show ourselves and how do we showcase ourselves to an international audience. So I'll just start with 1887, which was an exhibition that was held in Madrid. It was the 1887 Exposición General de las Islas Filipinas, a general exposition on the Philippine Islands that was hosted by the Spanish government. Again, at the time we were still a colony of Spain. It was held in the Tiro Park in Madrid. And this is the layout of that exposition where they had two different buildings that were, one was existing and another one was built. And then there was a moat that was then created, and then around it they created these small villages, recreating sort of different examples of traditional architecture in the Philippines. But this was the Palacio Cristal that was built specifically for the exposition, and this is still actually standing. This is still, it's now an art gallery. It used to be a conservatory, a greenhouse in the Tiro Park in Madrid, and this still exists today. But they housed different plants, coming from the Philippines, highlighting the tropical character of the archipelago. But around it, though, the Spanish government then decided to build different villages, including, they called one like the Rancheria de los Igorotes, literally meaning the Igorot Ranch, right? People coming from Ifugao. But they were calling them Igorot at that time. And what they did was that they built all of these small huts, supposedly replicating different architectures from the Philippines, and then they brought in Filipinos to live in those houses. They even had mga kalabaw, water buffaloes, to complete sort of like this image. and that's why if you look at it, like this is sort of like the beginning of theme parks, right? The idea of theme parks, of creating something that was very different, almost like fantasy settings, or if not, like an escape from reality. Again, because this was in Spain. But yet, when you go there, the idea is that you feel as if you're transported to tropical Philippines. So they had different architecture built, like some of these houses from the Igorot, for example, the Ifugao. And then they also had mock battles. Like they would perform as if like they're fighting, showcasing again sort of like different warfare armaments of the Igorotes at that time. So there were also other expositions in Spain done later on. But then during the American colonial period, after 1898, when the Philippines was then became part of the United States, one of the larger expositions that was held was in 1901 in Buffalo. There was one in 1898 in Omaha as we became part of the U.S. But then 1901 in Buffalo was one of the early major exhibitions about the Philippines. This is just a diagram showing you the layout of the exposition at that time, and then I'm highlighting here where the Philippine Village was. It was part of what was then called the Midway, and the Midway was sort of like the entertainment area of the exposition. Again, the precursor to what we know now as some of these theme parks. And this was the entrance to the Philippine Village. It looked like a big hut, and then it was sort of like a gateway using nipa palm, dry grass, and then with sort of like sawali, hand-woven mats. And then you can enter this village, and then you will arrive into a moated area. There was like another lake, and then they had built these houses again, supposed to replicate that of traditional lowland houses from the Philippines. Again, using nipa palm, dried grass on the roof. So you're kind of like seeing already the pattern, right, of like how they were showcasing that it was using traditional architecture, vernacular architecture to showcase the Philippines. They had a moat. You also had water buffaloes there, and you can actually ride the water buffaloes around the site itself. And then they featured also different sort of like cultural artifacts, warfare, and so on about the Philippines. And it was not until 1904, though, that then we had one of the largest exhibition about the Philippines during the American colonial period. And this was held in St. Louis in Missouri, a very sort of controversial exhibition, and it's relatively well known because this is the site of the exposition, and you see sort of like these neoclassical buildings, very formal. And then I highlighted there where the Philippine Reservation was. The Philippine Reservation was a huge area that was just dedicated to the Philippines. At that time, the American government was trying to highlight the importance of having the Philippines under the wings of the colonial government. Now, you have to understand also at that time that the U.S., they were having debates all the time in terms of like what to do with the Philippines together with the other former Spanish colonies like Cuba and Puerto Rico. And so there were these discussions about whether should the U.S. be colonial power, or should they not sort of like look at these colonies. But then at this time then, they were trying to showcase the Philippines as a sort of like a success story. They wanted to show how the Philippines has been successfully integrated within the control of the American colonial government. And so in a way, by having this Philippine reservation as part of this exposition, they were trying to show that we are indeed part of sort of like the story of the American colonial government. But if you look at closely at the site itself, it had replicas of intramuros. There was like the walled city in Manila. They had replicas of churches also. They had different examples of Spanish colonial architecture. But what was also quite radical at this time is that within this 47-acre site, they actually also built about 100 structures, and they built different villages again around it. So again, you're seeing sort of the same tactic and strategy of how the colonial governments would represent the Philippines. They would create all of these villages. There was the Igorot village, the Negrito village, the Visayan village, what they called the Moro village around, and then there was a lake. And then what was also crucial here is that they actually brought in 1,200 Filipinos to live in these villages. And they used, this was the Visayan village, and they would use the houses as a place where then these different Filipinos would then perform different dances, or they would perform different types of show. You know, they were really considered as entertainment. You know, and this is the Moro village where they then had all of these different traditional architecture. Now, I think you can begin to understand also that the way the Philippines has been presented here by the American colonial government, and including that of during the Spanish colonial period, is that the Philippines, and therefore the Filipinos, have been presented as very exotic and also primitive, right? They wanted to show, now why did they do that, right? They wanted to show the Philippines as still very primitive, right, and not civilized, because that was the only way that the American government can then justify why they needed to be in the Philippines. Because if the Philippines was already civilized, then there was no need for the US to be in the Philippines, right? So they were showcasing and trying to argue to the American public that, look, the Filipinos were very primitive and exotic, and therefore that the Philippines needed the US's help, right? So that was the narrative that they were also then saying, which was very similar to what then the Spanish colonial government, even back in 1887, were already saying. It was exactly the same thing. And these were just some of the performances where they would have the Igorotes again, you know, performing dances. And then, of course, like one of the most controversial part of it is that became sort of central to the argument of it, is that they showcased Igorot eating dog. You know, they would perform daily rituals by which then they would kill and they would eat the dogs to then to showcase to the American public. Again, because it shows that Filipinos then were primitive, right? This was sort of proof that that Filipinos were primitive. Of course, that's quite controversial, right? Because Filipinos, of course, if you look at us, you know, we're not primitive, right? But they were presenting the Filipinos as such to the American public, again, to justify why they had to be in the Philippines. And there was also a side story with St. Louis, is that for one, I saw a lot of newspaper articles talking about pets, dog pets that were disappearing because they were then collecting the dogs to then bring to the Philippine reservation. And there was also another sort of anecdote talking about how the Igorotes, for example, gained a lot of weight when they were there because they were eating dogs, which were very fatty, and because the dog eating, which was true that they would eat this, but during only special occasions and rituals, they would not eat it every day. And so they gained a lot of weight from eating a lot of the dogs, right? Again, because the Filipinos were considered as spectacle. You know, they were shown as something, as entertainment. And there are many more afterwards. There was 1909 in Seattle, 1915 in San Francisco, and so on. So there were many more representations very similar to the 1901 in Buffalo and 1904 in St. Louis. Now, we're zooming forward a little bit after World War II, when we have now gained our independence from the United States. And one of the earliest representations where the Philippines was shown was at the 1958 Universal Exposition in Brussels, in Belgium. And it changed a little bit in terms of how we were now represented, but our Philippine pavilion then is this structure that resembled that of the Bahay Kubo, the traditional lowland hut, you know, made of nipa. Except that the materials were no longer using bamboo or nipa or dry grass. They were showcasing it using concrete. They had the roof that was made of plastic. And then they had metal also. So it was already a change in terms of the representation, but it was still referencing that of the traditional architecture, right? And then they also had performances. So they did not have anybody sort of like living in this building anymore, but they had performances. And the Bayanihan Dance Group, which was actually established in 1957-58, their first performance internationally was at the Philippine Pavilion in Brussels in 1958. And so the sort of like the type of representation changed, and it was now replaced by dancers and performances, which was sort of being more neutral. It's not as controversial as the dog eating anymore, because they're showcasing how Filipinos now are more cultured, right? So that's the narrative that then the Philippine government was trying to do. Then there was already, then afterwards there was also the 1962 Seattle World's Fair. We were part in this international area. And then we have this pavilion. We were kind of like one of the pavilions where we had these wood screens, and then we had these capiz chandeliers in front. So we're also changing again the sort of the representation. Here are some of the capiz chandeliers that were designed more modern in a way it was sort of being shown. And this is the interiors where they featured textiles from the Philippines. They had brassware from Mindanao. They had wood, like Philippine mahogany, and again here some of the sort of like more modern capiz shells, right? So the materials was important to showcase the Philippines. And then later on, in the 1964 New York World's Fair held in Queens, the Philippines was actually close to the Unisphere, the center of the exhibition. This is the Philippines here. And the building itself is a modern interpretation of the salakot, the farmer's hat, which is sort of cut here. And then the building itself is like this two-story structure with the roof resembling that of the salakot. And then they had sculptures, carved murals done by Bottom Francisco on the lower part. And then they showcase also culture and science and technology and industry on the upper parts of the pavilion. And again, the Bayanihan Dance Troupe, let me adjust. The Bayanihan Dance Troupe again performed in the 1964 New York World's Fair. And here you see them as part of the pavilion, and then you see the Unisphere, which is the center of the exposition. Later on in Osaka in 1970, the building looked a little bit more modern now. It did not refer to any sort of traditional bahay kubo anymore, but it's sort of interpreted like a vinta or that of a soaring bird, depending on how you interpret it. But it was more modern using wood, dark mahogany, Philippine mahogany, and then glass. And then inside also highlighted Philippine mahogany as sort of like a feature. And then they also highlighted different textiles also coming from different parts of the Philippines. And then in 1992 in Seville, we somehow returned to this use of the bahay kubo again. This was done on two-story, and then here on the design, you can see the sort of like this bahay kubo, and then on the corner was this tower also with the bamboo nodes on the roof with this capiz shell mural showing different sort of parts of Philippine culture. Somebody's dancing, churches, and so on, highlighting different ways or different cultural aspects of the Philippines. And this is at night where the tower would glow, again using capiz shell as sort of like indicative of Philippine culture. And they had a restaurant at the bottom, and then they also had dances and performances during the exhibition. And then we come to 1998 in Expo Filipino in Clark, Pampanga, which was the 100-year celebration from independence from Spain. They designed this large exposition, and they had this freedom ring sort of in the center, which is this huge amphitheater with this stretched fabric structure, supposedly very modern type of architecture. But around it, they also designed different villages also, what they called in the chosen islands, Lupang Hinirang. And then they also had in the Colonial Plaza replicas of Intramuros, also Spanish church, and so on. So what we're beginning to see is that even as late as 1998, some of the ways by which the Philippines was represented back in 1887 are coming back again, right? The same sort of strategies, the same ways of showing the Philippines as exotic, and also in a way very primitive in some cases, again appeared in 1998. They had different replicas of different landforms, such as supposedly the Banawi rice terraces, right? Which, you know, it's debatable whether it looks like the Banawi rice terraces, and I'm comparing it to a picture of the real Banawi rice terraces. It was never completed, that's why maybe it didn't look like it was like Banawe. And then they also created villages again. There was the Kalinga village, the Ifugao village, they had the Legrito village, Agta village, they had the Maranao, and so on. And they also had performances. They hired actors to dress up like Ifugao or Maranao or Kankanay or Ibaloy and so on, different indigenous peoples, and they set it again in kind of like this very lush forest. And then they mixed it with different performances. And so these are some of the actors dressed up as Ifugao, and then also on the Maranao village where they're performing some of these dances and music. They also had replicas of different important events. And again, because it was 100 years, so for example, they had a replica of Baraswain Church in Bulacan, because it was the site of the first constitutional democracy, the signing. And this is the replica. This is the real one on the right. And then in the middle, they had this huge amphitheater that had performances in it all throughout the celebration of Expo Filipina. And this was called the Freedom Ring. So the question, though, is that over 100 years, I've only highlighted some of them. What has become apparent, and especially when I was studying this as a historian, what has become apparent is that it seems that as we are changing our ideas of what it means to be Filipino, we are somehow also repeating the ways that the colonial government have presented us before. And this is just a start image. The one on the left is 1904 in St. Louis. And the one on the right is 1998 Expo Filipino. If I didn't put a label, you can almost say that these are exactly the same. And I think that's, for me, what's, I guess, problematic, right? Problematic in the sense that how is it or why is it that as Filipinos, right, sometimes, you know, you can understand that why the Americans and the Spaniards were portraying us as primitive and exotic is because they wanted to prove that we needed them, right? But then how is it and why is it that as post-colonial Filipinos, now that we're supposed to be independent, why are we repeating kind of like the same image, right? Now, I have to say though, that right, of course, like we still have the Ifugao, the Kankanay, and all the other indigenous peoples. Of course, they have their they still have their culture. You know, it's not as if like it had disappeared. You know, and people are still wearing some of these clothes. You know, some of these costumes. But in some cases, for example, when you talk, for example, to people in Sagada, they themselves would tell you that, you know, please don't ask us to wear G-string or so on, because we're not that anymore, or that we wear that during special occasions. So the identities of, for example, of indigenous, of IPs, indigenous people, of these various ethno-linguistic groups, of course they have their ways of showing themselves, right? But why is it that as post-colonial Filipinos, we ourselves are repeating and reproducing the same narrative, exoticism and primitivist narrative that the colonizers have how they presented us? So that's That's the challenge, right? And that's the challenge, and that's why I'm asking also for us Filipinos who are, let's say, abroad, right? How do we show ourselves to Americans, or how do we show ourselves to an international audience, right? Do we want to keep presenting ourselves as exotic, right? Or is there a way for us to show our culture? You know, we still have our dances, we have our arts, we have our different lives, you know, but how is it that we are beginning to maybe reproduce or repeat the same exoticism that the colonizers have done? So can we present ourselves differently? Can we present ourselves that can be more empowering for us, right? Because we are now telling the story, and that is a challenge. How do we tell our own stories? In the same way, if let's say the people from Sagada are insisting and telling people who are visiting Sagada to say, like, you know, please don't ask us to wear G-string, right? Then how can we showcase ourselves? And how can we show Philippine culture without exoticizing ourselves? I don't have any answer at the moment, but what I'm telling you and what I'm showing you is that at least historically, this is how we've been presented, and I think we need to maybe begin to rethink of what it means to be Filipino, and therefore what it means to showcase ourselves. You know, I'm teaching in Cincinnati, and whenever I discuss, for example, I talk about the Philippines, and I talk about, because I'm an architect, I talk about the architecture in the Philippines. And then some people would still say, when I show them pictures, for example, of Manila, Cebu, Davao, you know, and they would say, like, huh, what? You have skyscrapers in the Philippines? Because their conception of what the Philippines is based on this. And then so I asked them, whose fault is that? Right? And so I think as Filipinos living abroad, we do have a big responsibility as well, right? We have to be critical also. You know, I don't think we just have to fall back to what has been done before, because it has its own problems. And therefore, if we are being treated in a certain way because we're presenting ourselves very primitive and uncivilized, then I think the onus is on us. We are then to be blamed. We cannot blame the colonizers anymore because we are now presenting ourselves. And so I'm really happy that the Philippine Consulate of Los Angeles, for example, have events such as this, because I think these are important venues by which then we can begin to discuss how is it that we also represent ourselves as Filipinos. And I would leave you with that question, you know, how do we represent ourselves now and in the future? How do we want other countries to see the Philippines and Filipinos? So think about that. And I think we can have more discussions later on. Maraming salamat po. Thank you very much.
Great. I guess we can entertain a question from Edson while we're waiting for the technical thing to get answered. Any questions from the gallery?
I think it was, sorry, the question was who chose the St. Louis site, right? Specifically for where the Philippines was shown, or just St. Louis in general? Right, right. The way some of these exposition sites are chosen is by, they propose, right? So from what I understand from the history of St. Louis, they propose that they be the host. And it's similar to how expositions now are also held, like, you know, for example, the country would bid. So for example, this coming 2020 will be in Dubai, Expo 2020, and we will have a Philippine pavilion there, which is also interesting. And they're focusing mostly on corals. That was the theme of next year. But yes, it's usually by bidding. Other questions? Yes?
I'm just curious, who curated the 98?
The 98, yes. who curated the 1998. It was a collaboration between different organizations. One was they hired a American firm, Douglas Gallagher, who did exhibition design. They've done Smithsonian and so on. That's one. But they also collaborated later on with a Korean. And then later on, the design was also done by actually a Filipino architectural firm who were actually my teachers at UP. But it changed so much. And so it's hard to tell now exactly who chose that narrative, but as much as I can tell, that narrative of like how the villages and so on has been there since the beginning of the proposal. So I suspect that was actually designed by American, right? So which then is to a certain extent no surprise, right? But at the same time, it was also designed. It was also then executed by Filipino architects. So why is it that they also did not maybe question it? That's a good question that I don't have the answer. I need to ask my teachers again who were involved in that. Yeah. You had a question?
Yeah. It seems like you're making the point that the only way to modernity is through skyscrapers and Western buildings.
No, not necessarily. I'm not saying that modernity is necessarily just defined by skyscrapers. I think that's what we have to define, right? But my question is, like, but why use the narrative of the colonizers? I think that's what I'm critical of, right? I'm not saying also that we have to reject it, right? But I think we need to be critical of it, right? Skyscrapers, unfortunately, or fortunately right now, is the reality of our Philippine cities. Now, I'm also not saying that that will be the only way to showcase ourselves, right? But in the Venice Biennale, for example, I chose to show what the Philippine cities are today. I showed some of these images as well, but at the same time, I also showcased how our Philippine cities now are also changing. Whether that's good or bad, I'm leaving that as a question because I'm not judging it. But I'm showing, especially during the Biennale in Venice, that that this is the reality of the Philippines. That it's actually not also very different from other cities around the world, right? But it has its own problems as well, right? And that is also not the solution. Skyscrapers are not necessarily the only solution. So that I'm also challenging. Is there a different way also to represent ourselves? Because that's sort of going back to a very specific idea of what it means to be modern, and sometimes it's actually also not good. But I'm not trying to pass any value judgment whether skyscrapers are bad or good at the moment, right? But I think we need to ask ourselves.
Can I ask a follow-up question? I can ask you later.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, can we continue the question later? Let's get it to Raymond first.
Okay, good evening. I'm Raymond Red. I'm a filmmaker. I also teach film in film workshops at the University of the Philippines Film Institute. I also am currently teaching at the De La Salle College of St. Benil School of Design and Arts in the digital film department. But my talk tonight is focusing on the cinema that we, or my generation, started back in the 1980s. And so I come from that generation of young filmmakers who were taking advantage of the technology that was available to us to be able to create cinema. And I guess the big question back then was, is this cinema? Is this legit cinema? And I'll show you an example of the types of films. Now, of course, we don't have much time tonight. I won't be showing full-length films. I'll show you one short film, the 12-minute Anino, the one that Ruben has mentioned, and the one that won in Cannes. So it may be a good example. That was made back in 2000 already, and it was still shot on film. So part of my discussion tries to focus on technology and how it has pushed forward this art form of filmmaking. You know, generally when you say cinema and films, everybody immediately thinks Marvel movies, you know, big Hollywood movies, they're showing in cineplexes and so on. But cinema did not really begin that way. And I mean, I don't want to bore you with too much history, but I need to show this so that I can refer to the main topic and relate it to what we are celebrating now. We are celebrating the centennial of Philippine cinema. So, you know, if you read through the history of cinema, of course, there's so much to read about. There were many inventors trying to do things. So this is just one example by Thomas Edison. It's called the kinetoscope. And, you know, you see a man, it's the start of the Nickelodeon where you put a coin and watch a short clip. Most of the films back then were less than a minute. You know? So that was the birth of world cinema. And, you know, pretty much like a game arcade today, you know, young people can go there and choose the type of films they'll watch, you know, look through the porthole and drop a coin. And of course, in France, you know, the French do claim that they invented cinema. The most famous, of course, are the Lumiere brothers, and they created these projectors, which were actually cameras themselves. Okay? So it's both the camera, it's the same device they used to shoot the film, and they set it up to become the projector with you know, a manual gear hand crank to run the film. That's the cinematograph, you know, the same device. And, you know, historians always refer to the birth of world cinema with these films, you know, the train arriving at a station, so it's by the Lumiere brothers, or workers leaving a factory. You know. So what's unique about these films, if we think this is the birth of cinema, what are they? They're documentaries, and they're short form. They're less than a minute, and in fact, cinema started as one shot, you know, almost like photography. Filmmakers would just point the camera and run out the film on the subject because they had no sense of film language yet, you know, of being able to tell stories with a series of images. Anyway, I'll jump through these other slides. You know, I use this to do my lectures for students. Now we move forward. So it's the technology that has been pushing it and affecting it. But at the end of the day, it's the filmmakers who are deciding how they use the technology and how they create the cinema and you know, engage themselves in the art form. And of course, you know, it started with film, the celluloid, and now everybody knows, you know, we use digital formats, and you know, a digital SLR camera like this is able to shoot HD video. Now relating it now to Philippine cinema, we acknowledge Jose Nepomuceno as the pioneer of Philippine cinema, and we mark the beginning of Philippine cinema in 1919 when Nepomuceno released under his production Malayan movies, Dalagang Bukid. So this was of course in the silent era still, you know, it's black and white, shot with a hand crank camera as you see there. And if you know the tradition of silent cinema, they would probably have live music, or sometimes even actors would either sing or, you know, recite a few lines live in the theater, just to add some sound. So this is of course a landmark achievement by Jose Nepomuceno, and that's why we celebrate 2019 as the centennial. Now, however, one of our professors, Professor Nick De Ocampo of the UP Film Institute, for the past, I think, 2 decades, as early as 20 years back, he was anticipating the celebration of the centennial of Philippine cinema. Now we call it Philippine cinema because it's the first time a film is fully produced, directed, and you know, the stories are rooted in Filipino realities. And yeah, produced and directed by Jose Nepomuceno. Of course, there was cinema even before this. We were an American colony and we were watching American and European films already. And in fact, the Spanish brought cinema as early as 1897. But this is the marking of the beginning of Philippine cinema because it's originally Filipino. Now, Nick de Ocampo's argument is quite important because through his research, he discovered that Jose Nepomuceno bought his equipment in 1917. And with these cameras, he started shooting news reels. So, back in history, there was no television yet. So where do you watch the news? In the cinemas. You watch the news in between the features, the main features. And Nepomuceno was already shooting news reels when he had this camera. It took him 2 years to produce the Lagang Bukid. So Professor Nick de Ocampo is arguing we should have celebrated the centennial 2 years ago. Precisely because when we speak of world cinema, we refer to train arriving at the station, which is just one shot and a short film, but it is legit cinema. So why not consider the first newsreels by Nepomuceno as the first Filipino films? So it's a very intriguing discussion, but we are now celebrating it. Now, the compromise was, I think some of our institutions, I mean, in fairness to our cultural institutions, film institutions like the Cultural Center, the NCCA, National Commission for Culture and Arts, the FDCP, Film Development Council of the Philippines, they all began special programs 2 years ago, 2017, to start the celebrations of the centennial. So that was kind of a compromise, but they culminated with big events in Manila this year. So in a way, we are still saying it's 2019. Anyway, but my point here is, Nick is arguing that cinema basically means moving images, and he has always been championing the importance of the form, whether it's long or short, and the different categories, whether it's a documentary, a narrative feature, fiction, or a true story, and animation. There are so many forms now, and basically what he's saying is we should still acknowledge the importance of the short form. So I'm mentioning this. I'll skip through the other slides again. Just a run through of what has happened in Philippine cinema here from our national artists and so on. So I'll just run through it because through the decades there were different periods where certain type of cinema became more popular, and of course it's the commercial mainstream cinema where we're used to watching a 2-hour full-length feature. So if you were able to watch something less than an hour, then you'd probably complain and want a refund. But the funny thing is the tradition of film having more or less a 2-hour length simply comes from the basic reason that the learnings from performing arts, from theater, is that people need to relieve themselves after around 2 hours, and that's why long theatrical performances would have intermissions. So that's the only reason why we got used to 2-hour films. So of course the heritage now of the history of the films that have been produced in the Philippines, it's very significant, and I fast forwarded to this era in the 70s and early 80s because this is the era that inspired our generation. And we have our national artists, Dino Broca, Ishmael Bernal, just to show some examples. One of the independent filmmakers as well from the 70s, Mike De Leon, and his classic film Kisapata, and many other films. Then of course from our national artists like Eddie Romero, I don't know if you're familiar with his films, Ganito Kami Noon, Paano Kayo Ngayon. And a lot of these classics were coming from the 70s. So it was that era when independent filmmaking became very, very prominent. Of course, there was independent cinema before that. What exactly is independent? There's always a discussion on this, and the popular word now, the shortcut is indie, you know. What exactly is that? It just began with a reference to filmmakers finding means to produce films independently from the main studios, the big companies who dominated the industry. So that's its basic meaning. So there were many independent filmmakers, of course, creating their own cinema. What's significant in the 70s is that these filmmakers, so that really marks a very specific type of cinema, which is independent and independent not only in the means of production, but they were very independent in choosing their voice, in making their statement, and that was a very bold act, of course, during that time. So in the 80s, so other films in classic films, you know, Oro Plata, Mata, and then so in the early 80s, of course, following the footsteps, or very closely following the footsteps of Lino Broca, Ishmael, there were filmmakers like Marilu Diaz-Abaya or Taike Galiaga, and many others. You know, of course, I'm not able to mention everyone. But from that movement, there was a realization by other filmmakers that apart from recognizing what is official cinema, what is mainstream, there was a means to have a separate voice and to use cinema as an art form and to make a statement. And that was the beginning of what I refer to as alternative cinema. And the word alternative defines it very clearly. If you fast forward to today, there's a lot of independent cinema. The alternative cinema will always define itself apart from everything else. There will always be an alternative. Filmmakers may move on and become mainstream directors. And there's nothing wrong with that, if that is the path they wish. But there will always be filmmakers trying to find new ways, new approaches of telling stories and making statements in a different approach and format. And so that defines what alternative cinema is. And generally, alternative cinema tended to be in short form. So it began in the 80s as short form. You might say it was because of economic reasons, because it's expensive to make films, and a lot of us were young students, you know, trying to create cinema that we wished were considered legitimate. And so we just made, you know, 10-minute, 15-minute films. But as we will see in history, the short form was very important, and now we're witnessing its resurgence on streaming, on the internet. I mean, a lot of talk now. I don't know how true it is, but they're saying, you know, people's attention spans have shortened, and they watch these 2-minute documentaries and short films on YouTube and all over the internet. And they're very powerful, as short as they are, and sometimes people even skip through them, even though they're only 2 minutes. So it's an interesting time. But going back to what we were trying to do back in the 80s, we were inspired by that generation of independent filmmakers, and we decided we can create our own cinema. So we were using Super 8 film. I don't know if you still know Super 8 film. So I always tell my students, because everybody knows digital, right? So I say that was our digital. You know, it was Super 8, a small film format. And here, actually, in the photo, you can see the beginnings of organizing independent film festivals. Nick De Ocampo is there in the lower photo, actually speaking to Mike De Leon with the glasses. So Mike De Leon was a staunch supporter of independent cinema, even though he was kind of considered officially in the mainstream. But he considered his films independent, and he also made short films. He actually did a few documentaries shot on Super 8. And then, of course, even before this happened, one person who was independent of the independent cinema was Kid Latahimik, who just this year was proclaimed National Artist for Film. Kid Latahimik, as early as 1977, made his films, you know, without support from any mainstream company. He's based in Baguio. He had all his equipment in Baguio. Produced his first film, Mababangong Bangungot. The English title was Perfume Nightmare. And he immediately gained recognition in international festivals. He won a prize in Berlin. Francis Ford Coppola picked up this film for distribution, limited distribution in the US. So it was under Zoetrope Studios. And so he was really kind of like considered the father of independent alternative filmmaking. So my point here is I'm trying to make a differentiation about the general word independent to refer to films, independent films, and alternative. A filmmaker can choose to remain alternative or move on to a different category in a career path. But the films will remain at its soul alternative because it's exploring new ways and experimenting on new, not only the means of production of making the films, but also in exhibition. So that was what we were trying to do. We had these small Super 8 projectors. We would run around classrooms and really painstakingly show our films one classroom at a time, because it was the only way. There was no internet, there was no YouTube, and there were no digital projectors like this. So it was a struggle. So here I just wanted to show some photos of those early short films. I won't be able to show them tonight, but you get an idea of the diverse subject matter that I tackle. I did a short film called A Study for the Skies on the lower left. So it's about a man who wants to fly. It's a short, very short, about 10 minutes long. I did a naturalistic drama called Kamada on the upper left here, and it's even quite ambitious. It was a period film with very low budget, shot on Super 8. It was about 25 minutes, so that was one of my more kind of realistic dramas. And then I did another surreal film. It's about nightmares. The Tagalog title is Ang Hikab. Hikab is yawn. And there you will see me editing my first 16mm film. So I always show this to students because to make them realize this is where it evolved from. I put my clips sa sampayan. So literally you clip it. You choose your shots and clip it, and you tape it together, piece together the whole film. This is just examples of some of the films I've done. Sakay was more or less the most commercial film I probably have done way back in '93. It's a historical film on Macario Sakay, the last hero who held out against the American colonizers in the early 1900s. Bayani was about the Katipunan, so I was dabbling in history in the early years of full-length films. So these were the full-length films I began doing in the 90s. So, Manila Skies, the real title is Himpapawid. This was actually shown quite a few times in LA already. Some 10 years ago, it was shown in the Los Angeles Asian Pacific Film Festival. Camera Obscura has been shown in other festivals. It's a more kind of experimental film, but it pays tribute to silent cinema and lost Philippine cinema heritage, precisely because I was kind of anticipating the celebration of the centennial of Philippine cinema. So I wanted to make a film that kind of showed the value of lost cinema, because if you do your research, practically no original silent films from the Philippines have survived. In fact, a lot of films from before the war are lost. There are a few that have been recently found, and some, I think, documentaries. But most of it has been lost. And I think the biggest reason for that was in World War II, most of the film companies were based in Escolta, in Manila. And Manila was heavily bombed, so a lot of these original film negatives were lost then. So there's only very recent awareness in trying to preserve the heritage of Philippine cinema, and I'm kind of really getting into that as well, and trying to even preserve my own films as early as now, because if nobody feels that my films are worthy of being preserved, then I might as well do it myself. So anyway, jumping here, a lot of film festivals, you may have heard of this. Many of these came about in the early 2000s, and in 2005, Cinemalaya was established, Cinema One Originals, and many other independent film festivals have been organized in the Philippines. And many of the films from these festivals are the ones that are actually making waves and gaining recognition in the international film festivals market. However, the sad reality is a lot of these films, full-length films, never really get any commercial distribution or have very limited screenings in the Philippines. So it's sad that many of these films are in fact Filipino films intended for a Filipino audience, and yet it's not reaching that intended audience. Of course, in recent years, there have been major strides in distribution and now online streaming. And of course, I'm very proud. My son here is Mikael. He's seated in the back. Why are you looking at the back? The one with the glasses, and he kind of looks like me, but of course he doesn't agree with that, with the cap. Mikael, has been said, his films were the first Filipino original content on Netflix, and we might as well plug it. His third Netflix film, Dead Kids, is premiering on December 1, right? Meaning it will be available worldwide on Netflix. So we've come to something like that. It's amazing, and I look back in what we were starting with Super 8 and struggling like guerrillas with these crude cameras, and look where it's going now. But what I'm trying to define is the mainstream still dominates the mainstream industry, and the official cinema, where a film has to be 2 hours and shown in a big Cineplex theater, is still what we call official cinema, when in fact there are other possibilities now. And of course now with the internet, it provides us other avenues now to be able to show experimental films, animation films, short documentaries, and so on. So even though I always show this, because even though it's driven by the technology, and these are some of the more advanced cameras, the Arri Alexa and the Red cameras, and that's a prosumer camera from Panasonic, but high-end quality images, and with all these new technologies, cinema has been pushed forward, and yet we always question where do we really want to bring it. So I always go back to this, the two images I showed earlier, the kinetoscope by Thomas Edison and the Mir Brothers cinematograph. It presents a very important issue to us right now. And what is that? This guy here is doing a solo viewing of a film, which most of us do now on your cell phones, on your tablets, on your laptops, because of streaming. Whereas the classic tradition of cinema, where it's projected in a big screen and it's watched by a large group of audiences, where the reaction of the audience to the film is more dynamic, and becomes organic in a way. I still believe in that, and I think many of us do, but it's becoming more prohibitive. Of course, the argument always is it's more expensive now to go to a theater in Manila. If you don't really earn much, you go to a mall, you park, you pay parking, you have to eat, and you're there with the whole family. So it's very expensive just to watch a movie, right? And the new alternatives have become very convenient. So it brings us to this point in history, actually. And so where do we bring that cinema? So I'm not criticizing Mikael's Netflix, okay? It's a very powerful way of distributing films. That's true. But do we want to kill off the other forms? And I say that because I'm not only referring to viewing, but the short form, the other forms of art film. I still engage in doing experimental films and short films. But I do keep on planning for full-length films as well because it is the tradition. So I did that lecture there, and maybe just to give you a sampling in case who has ever seen Anino by any chance? So maybe a few, okay, so there are quite a number of habits. So let's watch it. So just, to give you an idea of a short film. It's only 12 minutes long, and then we can proceed to discussions after this.
I have to do this questioning real fast. So if there's the first question for Raymond.
So you kind of touched, so you're an alternative filmmaker, and you kind of touched on the fact that commercial films and films that have a wide appeal in the Philippines, they do really well in the Philippines, but they don't do well on an international stage. Whereas alternative experimental film do well among the international film community. Like you said, Perfume Nightmare was picked up by Francis Ford Coppola. You were obviously at Cannes. So how do we merge those two ideas to have something that's commercially successful but also plays well on the international stage, like what South Korea is doing with Parasite and all the successes they've had?
Well, we're actually seeing that now. I'm seeing it with my son, Miguel. He's quite lucky. He's doing genre films, so you might say his films are a bit more accessible or maybe easier to sell to a distributor. But he has a unique situation wherein a lot of the mainstream producers are giving him creative freehand. And most of his films are his own material. It's his script or he co-wrote it. So that's a very unique situation. Now, not everybody gets that opportunity. So we're kind of seeing it, a means to being able to have unique, artist expression, able to put facets of your own thoughts, feelings in a film where maybe you have a bigger message and get it into a wide audience, on a bigger stage. I don't know how further that would go, or would the opportunity be available to more filmmakers? I really wouldn't know. But just slightly correcting what you said about, let's say, independent films, experimental films, they're doing well in the sense that they're being picked up in international festivals, but they're not getting any commercial distribution as well. Some of them do in limited forms, and again, streaming platforms is an interesting proposition for a lot of these smaller films. However, there are many full-length features made in those festivals that I mentioned, very good ones, but they never get any real exhibition and commercial distribution, both in the Philippines and abroad. So it's still really a very big problem. In fact, some people are saying there's too much content, there's too many filmmakers now, and too many films. But some others might say, well, there's nothing wrong with that. Okay, filmmakers can keep making films. There are a lot of educational institutions now. During my time, there weren't that many. There were some small workshops. There wasn't even a film major or a film program in UP at the time I was there. By the time the program was formally initiated in the University of the Philippines, I didn't feel like going back to school. So I was making films already and showing them in festivals. So. But different times now. So I always tell the students, you're very lucky with the situation. I guess the problem is because, and sometimes Mick and I joke about this. So allow me, Mick, to tell this joke again. No, because sometimes we kind of kid each other. And he says, you know, during your time, he would tell me this, there were only very few of you. So it was so easy to become famous or noticed. And I say, yes, that's true. There were only very few of us who were crazy enough to think that what we were doing would amount to something. And so now we're seeing it, and it's amazing. But yes, there are too many filmmakers, maybe, and not, even though there are more opportunities now, the opportunities are still not enough for the growing number of filmmakers and content being produced out there. So, but you know, apart from the number of films being made, I think it's creating an awareness that we can have a choice as viewers to watch other kinds of films. You know? I mean, if you want to watch Marvel movies 24 hours a day, that's your thing, then fine. You know, nobody can stop you. But we're trying to spread that awareness that people can watch other things, and of course we do see that on the internet. But there's that other argument, you know, that people tend to have shorter attention span now, and they skip through these very short films. So to be honest, I don't know where it's going, but the technology is pushing it. But at the end of the day, I say it's us, the people, the filmmakers, the viewers, who are using the technology, who will decide where we want to bring this.
One last question, please. We have to vacate. No more questions?
I'm curious to know how different or the same governmental support for filmmakers in the Philippines is. So when you started out, was there any? And now, you know, in the present time, has it increased? Does it stay the same? Or is there none?
There definitely is much more now, but like I was saying, there's also more filmmakers trying to apply for the same grant, for the same support, so it's becoming more difficult for them in that sense. During my time, there was very little. There was no Film Development Council back in the 80s. So now we have this institution that provides support in many aspects, both in distribution, exhibition, supporting filmmakers to travel to film festivals, giving some limited grant maybe for helping in production as well as distribution. So that definitely is a major help, but maybe we would say there's still not enough for everyone. So that is the problem.
Okay, I guess we'll have to close it at that. First, before that, let me acknowledge the presence of Eric La Chica here, who is with our census. Please try to get a hold of him because, you know, the census is very important to us. I'd also like to acknowledge the presence of Miss De Mauro there, who is our fiscal sponsor. Again, PURO Arte is a non-profit, and we do need funds to be able to move and present different programs, cultural art programs, and we need the help of the community through funds. Funds that are channeled through our fiscal sponsor tax. So thank you very much for for all your presence here. Thank you for Raymond and Edson. Thank you for the consulate, Philippine Consulate General, and thank you for your presence. Thank you so much.